Psychometrics LinkedIn group. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Nina, the group manager, and the purpose of these webinars is to really share the fantastic knowledge and expertise we have within this group. So today I'm delighted to introduce Tony Lyddon, who will be talking about selecting psychometrics really. He's very experienced and knowledgeable within the field of psychometrics, so I'm sure it will be a very interesting and insightful webinar. If you do have any questions or comments, then please write them in the chat box and then we'll address them as we go through. Perfect, so over to you, Tony.
Yes, hello everybody, and I'm hoping there's going to be a few more joining shortly, so I'll spend the first minute or so with a brief introduction. I saw on the website that advertised this session that there was one comment, who is Tony Lyddon? Well, I've been trying to answer that question for about 60 years, so I will not bore you with all those details. If you're really interested, there's a profile on LinkedIn, which I'm sure you will find. This is the first of 3 sessions which Nina has asked me to do, the second one being about using psychometrics in development. The third one I've entitled The Great Psychometrics and Work Simulation Bake Off. So I'm sure Nina will be publicising the third one at some point, but the second one of those is the same time next week. But without further ado, I'm going to spend about 20 to 25 minutes going through a presentation, which you will be able to draw down from the site very shortly. And then we'll leave a little time at the end if there's anybody who wants to give us any questions over the chat line. And you'll see the chat box is bottom right hand of your screen somewhere. Anyway, let's move on. So I've selected this. If you were choosing a house or a car, wouldn't you do it this way? Because I've been told by my fellow professionals they're having real difficulty selling the idea of using psychometrics into their businesses. And I have to say I'm quite shocked about the lack of use of what I would regard as the top level psychometrics that I've certainly found since I've left corporate life. So anyway, what we'll do is we'll go on and we'll look at the first set of slides. And well, I've used this slide in a previous presentation, but I think it's still highly relevant because if you get these sort of selection decisions wrong, then frankly you incur cost in various processes downstream, and the real problem is that these costs tend to be hidden because they tend to involve a lot of people time, and if you carry on doing it the way you've always done, and it's Einstein's definition of insanity, you get the same result. And those costs are always underestimated, and I think the CIPD estimated the average cost of getting it wrong per case, this was about 3 years ago I think, was about £20,000. Well, having been involved in quite a lot of executive selection, not myself, but seeing the results of it, I can tell you it's a lot higher than that. And I wanted to use this example because if you were going to buy a house, I think you'll find that is quite similar to the one I showed before, because if you do the searching, buying, moving, settling, and possible legal action if it goes wrong, and then you do it all over again and you still don't do it the right way, I would suggest to you that not only do you get the same result, you may actually damage your long-term relationships with your partner if you've got one, and that could end up you're in a much smaller property somewhere else. And again, these costs are always underestimated because the opportunity cost of the time or the divorce is the killer. And if you think about the amount of money you're expending on buying a house, or even if a rental, you know, over 10 years, your rental could be as equally as large in terms of your bank balance. I think with all big ticket items, you've got to think about preparation. And I'm not going to read right through the list, but some of the things about, you know, your needs and desires, they're not the same thing, are they? You know, oh, I need this big expensive car. No, you don't. You desire it, let alone whether you can actually afford it. But then you've also got to work out where you can find it. You know, and now, of course, online you can go and look for new houses or something, and there's lots and lots on Rightmove and all those sort of places. But you've also got to think about what you're going to trade off. There isn't the perfect house out there. There isn't the perfect car. There isn't the perfect employee. They're all slightly different. So you really need to make a checklist of what you're going to do and what is tradable. And once you've got your checklist, well, you go and look, don't you? And you tend to tick off against each item that you look at the things that you're good and they're bad. You probably do if you're buying a house, if you're buying a car, but I get the impression that not everybody is doing it if they're doing it for an employee or potential employee. But if you are doing it, you end up with a long list. And then you go and look again. And you may get a second opinion. So, you've been viewing this house and then the other partners at work and the children, if you've got any at school. And at the weekend, you're probably taking them all to have a look at this long list. And from that, you'll say, well, we quite like this one. We don't like that. We'll make a short list. And you make a short list because you really cannot afford to do the next stage on a long list if you've got anything about you. When I bought a house, the house I'm sitting in at the moment, one of the key things was to work out whether there was enough space for all the furniture. And there just about was, but you could have got it really wrong because behind me, I've got a huge cupboard, and that could have been very awkward to place. Anyway, so you've had a look at that. You then think about, well, is this place in the right state of repair? Well, it might be, but actually some of the fixtures and fittings I don't like. And I have to tell you, in this house, the carpets were appalling, as were most of the curtains and the decoration. It took me about 10 years to put it right. But I took a value judgment on what value I could add to the property. And that, again, is what you might do to an employee. Okay, they're a bit short in some areas, but what value can I add? Is there potential for stretch here? Might they be very useful in another way in the long term? And so you're looking at all that sort of stuff. But the thing that always worries people is what you don't know and you can't see, because you can't dig up the floorboards. And I guess one of the big lessons I wanted to put across today is you need an expert opinion. And that expert opinion allows you to make commitment or walk away. I showed this to several people, including in the last presentation I did for Nina, and one of the things that surprised me, and I asked people because they expressed surprise at this diagram. I said, aren't you taught this in your CIPD qualification? They said, no, we've never seen it before in our life. Johari's window, to me, is one of the key concepts that forces you down the route of saying, look, not only do I not know a lot about this person the other side of the table, but they may not know much about themselves either. So what you've got to do is to help yourself and help them to try and reduce the size of this unknown area, let alone the blind area or the hidden area. The hidden area being the one which is unknown by others and known by self. And of course, you're not allowed to torture people or waterboard them and all these horrible other things people do to talk if they're nasty people. You're not allowed to do that in recruitment. So you've got to use other ways of finding that. But of course, if stuff is known by others but unknown by self, then people need to be coached and given the opportunity to make informed choices about what they want to do. And in many ways, that's the subject of my second talk, about helping people to understand their blind areas. And the third talk is written really more about the hidden area and how you can get into that hidden area without actually doing the nasty sort of things I referred to earlier. Anyway, so for big ticket items like a house, what do? Well, you go and get a full structural survey by a qualified surveyor. And you pay whatever that is. It's a long time since I had one done because I've been in this house for nearly 30 years. But whatever it's £1,000, and that is a risk premium that you pay to make sure you don't make a huge mistake. And of course, the major mistake you might make is if the house is liable to subsidence or something's going to be built over the fence within the next 3 years, and you need to know this stuff. Similarly, if you're buying a car, then if it's a second-hand one, that you are strongly advised to get a full mechanical inspection by a qualified mechanic. And in the UK, that's normally by one of the major automobile clubs or associations. With an employee, my feel for it is that big companies are doing the sort of full structural survey and full mechanical inspection, but not a lot of other people are. I really wonder about that, because if you think about the size of an organization, say if you're an organization of 10,000, the risk of getting it wrong may be just as great, but actually, if for every single employee, the risk on your ultimate business outcomes proportionately is less. If you're actually a smaller organization, but you're, say, medium size, and you've got 300 employees, then automatically the risk of getting that decision, that people decision wrong, is in the magnitude of like 10. So why on earth wouldn't you get somebody who's professionally qualified to use the right tools to measure what you're getting? And there are going to be trade-offs, and there will be development needs, and there will be no-nos where that gap between what you want and what you need is so big that it's not worth taking the risk. But unless you actually find out, I would suggest to you that you're taking an enormous risk. Now, for big ticket items, there are normally limitations. Most sellers do not let you trial their house or their car for months before you buy it. Now, I know some people say, oh, I tell you what we'll do, we'll get this person in on a temporary basis for 6 months on probation. If they are not any good, we'll get rid of them. Well, what damage are they actually doing while they're there if they aren't any good? You probably see the damage that you see, but you can't see the damage they haven't done. There'll be, for every single person who says, oh, this person's useless, there are going to be another 5 or 6 out there saying they're useless. And what they're also going to be saying is, who's the useless idiot who recruited this person? So, again, those hidden costs, those hidden reductions in motivation and commitment by other people, it's not worth taking the risk. Now, you might be able to rent a similar one for a period, but if you're not actually getting the real thing, then what's the point? And of course, the other thing is, someone else may get there first if that was the right one for you to buy and you actually lost it. And, when you're selecting people, there will be the recruitment process may drag on, and somebody may say, oh, I want to interview 6, not 3, and you've lost that one. So again, you need to be very focused. So letting desire take over from need is also another problem. You want a blue car, so you buy a blue car and then find you can't take the kids to school because there's no room in it. I mean, that may seem very simple example, but you do see this sort of thing going on. Other people would recognize that sort of thing as sort of unconscious bias. I'm not a great fan of that unconscious bias. I think most biases are either conscious or semi-conscious, and some of them can be self-serving. You want somebody who will be like me. So, I want to recruit my friend because they worked with me well before. They swept up all the rubbish that I left behind. You probably met people like that. They recruit their friends again and again as they move from organization to organization. I originally worked for an organization which didn't allow that. In fact, you got a lot of people to manage, and that was quite a good discipline, actually. And then we get more into psychometrics themselves. This slide, a favorite slide of mine, came from Lominger, that's Lombardo and Eisinger's work on senior executives in the 1990s, which was reinforced by the CIPD in 2016. If you look at the data, only 30% of effective performance is due to training. It's 70% recruitment. So you better get that right beforehand. Because if you want to select a racehorse and you end up with a donkey, it's your fault. They may look the same. They may have tails. They may have big ears, but they aren't the same thing at all. And of course, the challenge, which we've really been talking about for the last quarter of an hour, is really about raising the bar in standards of talent management to reduce the risk of failure. We've sort of started to talk about the one in the middle. The job analysis and the law is about getting that checklist and making sure it's legally compliant. But making sure that you look in the widest possible area is true as well. I remember seeing a television program, and they were trying to take people to look at houses in the country, and they took these people round and they said, oh, well, actually, we saw this house online, but we didn't think it was what we wanted, so we didn't come and see it. Of course, by not actually giving yourself the biggest pool of things that look reasonably like what you want, then you're going to be in big difficulty. So having things like applying a Rooney rule, saying, well, we will have a short list or even a long list, let alone a short list, which has a diverse range of talent by sex, by racial origin or orientation. Those things are quite important, because if you're using agencies, they'll tend to want to sell you the people they've got on their database, not the best people who might be around. So they need to earn their fees. Their justification is that they want to get their fees as quickly as possible. Well, that's not good enough. You need to make sure they're doing the best for you. But of course, the other problem you've got is that if there are managers around who are not tuned in to the standard ways of selecting, then they are going to mess it up for you, and they'll also not follow through in employment. So they will almost re-recruit people while they're working for them. And so you need to make sure that you recruit using managers who understand these sorts of processes. And the sort of logic you can apply, in addition to saying, well, look, no, you wouldn't buy a house this way, you wouldn't buy a car this way, is, the data is out there. It tells you if you are more focused on what you're looking for using structured interviewing, tests and simulation, then the chances of you getting somebody who can perform at work are going to be radically improved. That is what the data said. This is SHL's data from about 30 years ago. The data has been reproduced consistently, and it's because predictive correlation is based on concurrent measures of the sort of people who are likely to perform well against other candidates that are put up against them. And the research evidence also suggests that although people, for some reason they do this, traditionally you'd say it's abilities, skills and knowledge you look for in selection. And you do that by looking at skills, knowledge and experience, even though it's very, very difficult to evaluate previous experience. And actually, the critical things that are likely to derail are behavior and abilities. I think if you may have this experience, but certainly my experience at work, generally, as long as people keep their skills and knowledge up to date, it's always the difficulty with relationships that actually catch people out, particularly the higher up the organization you get. So if you don't actually look for those sorts of things when you're selecting people, that is likely to be the thing which generates the biggest bill. Well, what to look for from test suppliers, I'm not going to go through this in depth other than to say that unless people are trained to use these types of instruments to the right level, the highest level you can get, then I wouldn't bother doing it, because what's worse is using something inappropriately. And test suppliers also the best ones offer conversion training for people who are already at those standards. And if they aren't offering conversion training, or the training falls well short of those standards, you really have to ask the reason why. You also have to make sure that the test validity and reliability data is made available to you before purchase, in the same way as that you would expect if you're buying a car, that it's got a brochure. It explains what the car does, the engine power, the acceleration, all those sorts of things. You need to have that stuff before you buy. And it's got to be sold as fit for purpose. I guess the other big one, and I keep seeing this on posts and it really annoys me, is to say, look, you use trait-based tools for non-cognitive testing in selection, not type indicators, because type indicators are not properly normed, and well, they aren't normed, most of them aren't normed, and they're not the full picture. They're excellent development tools, but they are not there to help you to compare one person to another. So the message is buyer beware. You've got to use the same sort of techniques as you would use if you were buying other big ticket items, because it is a big ticket recruiting somebody. So what do you avoid? Well, in a building society survey is not for your benefit. It's to decide whether they've got a reasonable prospect of getting their money back. So that's why it's cheaper. So you shouldn't rely on it. Similarly, if a car's got an MOT as evidence it's okay. That's not good enough, because it could be 11 months ago and the tyres are worn out. And just for anybody in the UK, the MOT standards are about to get much more difficult. So if you do not take the risk, your car is likely to fail if you don't make sure that you've done all the sort of checks that you've got in the handbook already, and particularly if you go to a dodgy dealer. Surveyor who's left their tape measure behind is no good, so they've got to have all the toolkit right, in the same way as the mechanics working on your car. If you have one that doesn't have the metric tools, they use the nearest imperial one, they're probably going to damage the car. So for that reason, that's the same reasons why you've got to apply the same caveat emptor, buyer beware techniques to recruiting employees. So to sort of bring that into a final shape, you need to have valid and reliable criteria. So if you're not using a competency model, and not big organizations do, you need to do your job analysis properly. Then you can use the results from your psychometrics map to both of those. In terms of reliable processes, you need to get your managers and the people who are assessing to focus on what they're doing, not what they would like to be doing. They observe and then record against this model of valid and reliable criteria. Then they categorize and evaluate against that criteria. They've got to be trained thoroughly in behavioral observation to do this, to try and remove as much bias as they can. And they must be capable and available to peer review each other's observations and recording, first of all, but also whether they can categorize and evaluate reliably. And it's just spreading that good practice. So the question is, can you convince your leaders about this? Well, at the end of the day, it comes back to the money. The risk involved in getting it wrong is not just that £20,000 the CIPD put up. I mean, that's the sort of average. If somebody's recruited, it's wrong, and you end up in court for discrimination for any reason, the bill is unlimited. So you're getting into potentially house purchase type compensation, hundreds of thousands of pounds of whatever currency you care to mention. So that is the critical thing. So they've got to realize, you've got to sell in the fact that it's just the same sort of financial risk as any other investment that they may be making. So that's the message. If you were choosing a house or a car, wouldn't you do it this way? So I hope by just taking you through that, and I know some of you may be more experienced in selection and using this type of tool, so it may be a bit simple, but for those of you who are not familiar with that, I hope that's useful to you. And if you've got any questions, in the next couple of minutes, I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you go to the chat box and put them up, then we'll come back and I'll answer them online.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tony, for that. That was really interesting. And I love that the analogy between obviously you know, selecting individuals and buying a car or a house, because it's something that we know how to do. So it's a good kind of analogy because you can relate to it very nicely. So thank you so much for that. That was really interesting. And like Tony says, if anyone's got any questions, then please put them in the chat feature, or alternatively, you can email me afterwards and we can address them then. I think probably your presentation was so good, Tony, that everyone's completely clued up on everything, and that's why there's no questions.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
And you know, give you a couple more minutes if you want, but you know, I'll just thanks very much for that, James. I see you just put thank you up, but much appreciated. We'll stay on just for a couple more minutes if anybody has got a question, but then it's you too long.
And do join us for next week. As Tony says, he'll be doing another kind of bite-sized webinar, because I think these are quite nice lengths, aren't they? They're kind of easy for people to listen to during lunch or anything like that. So as he says, we'll be looking at the development side and things on Monday next week. So do join us then if you can.
Yes, okay. Thanks very much, Nina. Well, I think perhaps we'll go offline now, and thank you very much for those of you still attending. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Bye.